My name is Charlotte. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate strategy for a mid-sized technology firm in London. I'm a daughter, a sister, a quiet friend who remembers birthdays without Facebook reminders. At work, I'm the one people describe as steady, reliable, uncomplicated. No one has ever called me threatening. If you met me in a meeting, you might not notice me first. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for air. I don't decorate my sentences with sharp edges. I take notes. I ask precise questions. I follow up. I build frameworks while others build impressions. And for years, that combination made me valuable, but not visible. Or so I thought. This story isn't about a dramatic firing or a screaming match in a glass conference room. It's not about revenge. It's not about exposing a monster. In fact, the man at the center of this story, my direct manager, was widely respected, articulate, strategic, trusted by senior leadership, the kind of leader who mentored loudly and praised selectively. For a long time, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I delivered consistently enough, growth would follow naturally. Promotions were described as merit-based. Performance reviews were framed as transparent. Career paths were presented as linear, if you were patient. But over time, I began to notice something strange. Opportunities passed me by in subtle ways. Projects I initiated were reassigned for visibility. My performance evaluations were strong, but never strong enough. Words like excellent contributor appeared repeatedly. Words like ready for the next level did not. At first, I internalized it. Maybe I wasn't assertive enough. Maybe I needed to speak more in meetings. Maybe I lacked executive presence. I enrolled in workshops. I requested feedback. I refined my delivery. Nothing changed. It took me years to realize the truth. The moment I realized my direct manager had blocked every path of my promotion because he feared I'd take his seat was not explosive. It was quiet, almost clinical. A single piece of information clicked into place, and suddenly every missed opportunity, every stalled evaluation, every invisible ceiling made sense. My growth was never a threat to the company. It was a threat to him. This story is about what happens when you understand that the obstacle in your path isn't incompetence, and it isn't fate. It's fear, someone else's fear, disguised as guidance. It's about what I did after that realization. Not loudly, not recklessly, but deliberately. I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't pretend I was perfect or entirely innocent. I stayed longer than I should have. I doubted myself more than I should have. I mistook silence for professionalism. But I also learned something powerful about quiet leverage, about documentation, about patience, about choosing a move that cannot be undone without ever raising your voice. If you've ever felt like your effort disappeared into someone else's shadow, if you've ever sensed that the rules applied differently to you but couldn't quite prove it, you might recognize parts of yourself in this story. Tell me if have you ever suspected that your ceiling wasn't structural but personal? To them, I was safe. That's the word I would use now. At the time, I might have said dependable, or consistent, or low maintenance. But safe is more accurate. In meetings, I was the one who came prepared with data tables, already formatted, and risk assessments already outlined. I anticipated objections before they were spoken. I translated chaos into clean slides. If something needed to be done properly the first time, it came to me, and it stayed with me. I rarely pushed back publicly, not because I didn't have opinions, I did, but because I had learned that timing mattered. That precision mattered more than volume. While others debated loudly, I waited until the room thinned out and sent a follow-up email that quietly redirected the strategy. It worked. Projects improved, deadlines were met, senior stakeholders praised the output. They just didn't always remember my name when they did. My direct manager, Daniel, described me in performance reviews as an anchor to the team. He said it warmly, like it was a compliment. An anchor stabilizes. An anchor prevents drift. An anchor also stays at the bottom. I didn't notice the weight of that metaphor at first. I was proud of being the steady one. In a company that prized bold personalities and sharp presentation skills, I assumed there was room for someone who built the structure underneath. When new hires joined, I onboarded them. When executives needed background context before a board meeting, I prepared the briefing notes. When a project veered off course, I was asked to quietly fix it. I became the person who made other people look competent, and for a while, that felt meaningful. The problem was not that I was invisible. It was that I was selectively visible. Inside the team, everyone knew I was capable. Colleagues asked for my input before making decisions. Some even joked that I was the real strategist. But upward visibility, the kind that translates into title changes and compensation adjustments, filtered through Daniel. And Daniel curated narratives. When he presented our department's achievements to senior leadership, he highlighted collaboration. He highlighted innovation. He highlighted momentum. My work appeared on slides, but my ownership did not. I told myself that was normal. Managers summarize, leaders consolidate credit. It's part of the structure. Besides, Daniel was personable. He invited me to high-level meetings occasionally. He asked for my perspective in one-on-ones. He told me I had strong, long-term potential. Long-term. That phrase began to follow me. When a promotion cycle came and went, I was told I was very close. When a cross-functional leadership role opened, I was told it might be too early. When I asked what specifically I needed to demonstrate, the feedback was abstract. More executive presence, broader influence, clearer authority in the room. Authority. It was interesting, because inside the team I already had it. People deferred to me on technical direction. They waited for my assessment before finalizing proposals. But authority that isn't formally acknowledged becomes a shadow version of leadership. It carries responsibility without protection. Still, I didn't question Daniel's intentions. Why would I? He advocated for me, at least verbally. He said he valued my growth. He said he saw me as part of the company's future, and I believed him. There's a particular vulnerability that comes with being competent, but not confrontational. You assume systems are neutral. You assume effort compounds. You assume that if you are indispensable, you will be elevated. I was indispensable, but not elevated. Looking back, I can see the pattern more clearly. I was given work that expanded my skill set, but not my visibility. I was positioned as the stabilizer, not the face. When high-risk initiatives surfaced, the kind that, if successful, would change perception, they were reassigned for strategic exposure. At the time, I interpreted that as protection. Maybe Daniel didn't want me tied to potential failure. Now I understand something else. To them, I was safe because I didn't disrupt the hierarchy. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I didn't threaten existing power structures. I improved them quietly. And as long as I remained that version of myself, capable, agreeable, contained, everyone benefited. Everyone except me. The first time something felt wrong, it was small enough to ignore. That's how these things begin. We had been preparing a strategic expansion proposal for nearly 3 months. A complex market entry analysis that required financial modeling, regulatory research, and competitor positioning. I led the groundwork. I built the financial sensitivity scenarios. I identified the risk thresholds. I even drafted the narrative arc for the executive presentation. Daniel was meant to refine and present it to the board. The night before the presentation, he asked me to stay late and polish a few slides. I didn't hesitate. We sat across from each other in a nearly empty office. The city outside dim and reflective. I remember feeling proud. This was important work, high visibility. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, this is excellent thinking. Exactly the kind of depth we need at leadership level." Leadership level. I allowed myself to absorb that. The next day, I wasn't invited to the boardroom. That in itself wasn't unusual. Senior meetings were selective. But as the hours passed, I noticed something odd. Colleagues began messaging me. "Great job on the expansion idea," one wrote. "I didn't realize you'd pivoted the risk model like that." "Smart move," said another. Pivoted. I hadn't pivoted anything. The pivot had been Daniel's suggestion, made at 11:43 p.m., after I'd already finalized the framework. I had disagreed quietly, but incorporated his adjustment. When he returned from the board meeting, he was energized. The proposal had been approved for Phase 1 exploration. Leadership was impressed. He stopped by my desk. "They loved it," he said, "especially the risk mitigation angle." "That's good," I replied. He smiled, almost casually. I emphasized how we restructured the financial model last minute. Showed agility. We restructured. Agility. It was subtle. so subtle that if I repeated the conversation aloud, it would sound harmless. Managers say we all the time. They present team efforts as collective. That's leadership etiquette. But something didn't sit right. Later that week, a summary of the board meeting circulated internally. It credited Daniel for strategically reframing the expansion model to address volatility concerns. It mentioned his decisive analytical pivot. My name appeared once, under contributors. I read the document twice, then I closed it. I told myself it didn't matter. The project was approved. The work was moving forward. Impact was what counted, not attribution. Still, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote down the date of the presentation. I wrote down the original modeling structure. I wrote down the timestamp of the version history, not out of anger, out of clarity. It wasn't that Daniel had stolen an idea outright. He hadn't fabricated my work. He had simply repositioned it, tilted the narrative slightly so that the decisive moment, the moment leadership remembered, belonged to him. And I had allowed it. That was the first cut, not dramatic enough to protest, not obvious enough to escalate, just precise enough to adjust perception upward, in his favor. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift. When executives referenced the expansion initiative, they directed strategic questions to Daniel first. He would answer broadly, then defer technical clarifications to me. I became the detail layer. He became the architect. At first, I rationalized it as hierarchy. Of course, they would look to him. He was the manager. That was his role. But I couldn't ignore a quiet question forming beneath the surface. If the structure I built could be reframed so easily, what else could? That's when I began paying closer attention, not to what was said in rooms, but to how stories were told after. Because influence doesn't just live in decisions. It lives in retellings. And in that retelling, I had already been edited. After the expansion proposal, nothing dramatic changed. That's what made it dangerous. Daniel didn't become colder. He didn't exclude me from meetings. In fact, he increased my involvement. I was looped into more strategic discussions, asked to draft more executive summaries, given more responsibility. On paper, it looked like growth. But something subtle had shifted in the pattern. Whenever an initiative began in ambiguity, when structure didn't yet exist, I was brought in early. I built the model. I identified dependencies. I anticipated objections. I wrote the first version of the story. Then as visibility increased, Daniel stepped forward. He would refine the narrative, simplify it, add one or two framing decisions that sounded decisive. By the time it reached senior leadership, the intellectual backbone was still mine, but the defining moment belonged to him. The first time I noticed. The second time, I questioned myself. By the third, I began explaining it away. He's the manager. That's how it works. He's better at executive framing. I'm still learning how to position ideas. There's a psychological comfort in self-blame. It preserves your belief in the system. If the system is fair, then the gap must be yours to close. So I tried to close it. I enrolled in an executive presence workshop. I practiced speaking earlier in meetings instead of waiting. I volunteered to present smaller updates directly. Daniel encouraged it, but carefully. You're strong in analysis, he would say in feedback sessions. Just make sure you're not overloading the room with detail. It sounded helpful, constructive, yet I noticed something curious. When he presented, detail was described as rigor. When I presented, it was described as density. Language matters. During one quarterly review, he told me I was essential to team stability. He praised my consistency. He highlighted my reliability under pressure. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, to move to the next level, leadership needs to see you owning broader vision, not just execution. I nodded, but inside something tightened, because I was already shaping vision. I just wasn't credited for it. Still, I didn't confront him. Confrontation felt disproportionate. There was no singular incident outrageous enough to justify it, only accumulation. And accumulation is easy to normalize. When a cross-functional task force was created to explore AI integration across departments, I assumed I would be nominated. I had already drafted an internal white paper on the subject months earlier. Instead, Daniel selected a colleague with less technical depth but stronger presentation flair. It's about exposure, he explained when I asked privately. You're already overloaded. This will give him growth opportunity. Growth opportunity. I absorbed the message. Your contribution is assumed. His visibility is strategic. Again, not blatant enough to protest. not unfair enough to escalate, just calibrated enough to stall me while appearing equitable. Colleagues began coming to me quietly. You should have been on that task force. Everyone knows you built the AI framework. You're basically running half this team. They meant it as validation, but validation without structural change becomes a quiet form of gaslighting. You're powerful, they imply, just not officially. I started adjusting my expectations downward. I told myself that titles were cosmetic. That influence didn't require recognition. That patience was maturity, and in doing so, I participated in my own containment. There's a particular fatigue that comes from being perpetually almost ready, almost promoted, almost visible, almost acknowledged. You begin to internalize the almost as identity. Daniel never raised his voice at me. He never insulted me. In fact, he often praised me, especially in private. He told me I was one of the strongest analysts he'd ever managed. But praise without progression becomes sedative. It keeps you still. Looking back, I can see how skillfully the pattern sustained itself. I was given complex problems, which kept me engaged. I was given verbal affirmation, which kept me hopeful. I was given just enough exposure to feel included, but never enough to alter perception upward. And because nothing felt overtly hostile, I convinced myself it was normal professional friction. That's how disrespect embeds itself in high-functioning environments. Not through humiliation, through omission, through carefully distributed credit, through repeated suggestions that you are invaluable, just not yet elevated. By then, the small cuts were no longer isolated. They were architecture, and I was still calling it patience. There comes a moment in every environment where you realize you're not just doing a job, you're playing a role. I didn't see it clearly at first. I only felt the edges of it. In team meetings, when tension rose or deadlines tightened, eyes would shift toward me. Not for direction, for stabilization. Charlotte will sort the model. Charlotte can sense check the numbers. Let's have Charlotte draft the summary. It was said with trust, with relief. I was the quiet infrastructure. When conflicts surfaced between departments, Daniel would sometimes bring me into the conversation afterward. Can you smooth this out? He'd ask. Just align everyone quietly. Quietly. That word followed me more than I noticed. I wasn't positioned as the visionary. I wasn't positioned as the negotiator. I wasn't positioned as the risk taker. I was positioned as the finisher. The closer, the one who made sure nothing embarrassed the team. At first I wore it like competence. There is dignity in being dependable. There is power in being the person others rely on. But over time, I began to see the trade. The more reliable I became, the less interruptive I appeared. The less interruptive I appeared, the less threatening I seemed. And the less threatening I seemed, the safer it was to keep me exactly where I was. I remember one particular off-site workshop. The executive team had gathered to redefine our 3-year strategy. I spent 2 weeks preparing pre-reads, synthesizing market data, outlining possible pivots. When the workshop began, Daniel facilitated. He stood at the front of the room, confident, animated. He referenced frameworks I had drafted. He simplified the strategic branches I had mapped out. He presented a refined direction. At one point, he turned to me and said, almost graciously, "Charlotte has done great groundwork on this." Groundwork. The room nodded appreciatively, and then the conversation moved on. Groundwork is necessary. It's foundational. But foundations are rarely celebrated. They are expected. During a break, one of the directors approached me quietly. "You should be leading sessions like this," she said. "You clearly see the patterns." I smiled. "I'm happy to support." Support. That word slipped out automatically. On the train home that evening, I replayed the day in my head. I realized something uncomfortable. I had never once interrupted Daniel to clarify authorship. I had never once said, "To expand on the model I built," or "when I structured this scenario." I had allowed the framing, because part of me believed that if I was patient enough, recognition would eventually align with contribution. But patience without boundary becomes compliance, and compliance becomes identity. Daniel once told me, in what he likely meant as encouragement, "You're the backbone of this team." Backbone. Strong, essential, hidden. I began to see the pattern more clearly. My role wasn't accidental. It was convenient. I absorbed complexity so others could appear decisive. I mitigated risk so others could take visible swings. I held institutional knowledge so transitions felt seamless. If I were promoted, that stability would shift. A new manager would need time to understand the machinery I quietly operated. Visibility would redistribute. There is comfort for some leaders in having a highly capable subordinate who does not disrupt the hierarchy. I fit that mold perfectly. The realization didn't make me angry, not yet. It made me reflective. Had I chosen this role, or had I simply never resisted it? There is a difference between being reliable and being confined. I was starting to suspect I had crossed that line long ago, without noticing, and once you see the role assigned to you, you can't unsee it. The question becomes whether you continue performing it. The shift didn't happen during a performance review. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a meeting that was supposed to be routine. We were discussing headcount planning for the next fiscal year. Budget constraints, resource allocation, growth projections. It was procedural, almost dull. Daniel was presenting the proposed team structure to our department director. A slide appeared outlining future leadership needs. One bullet point caught my attention: potential succession pathway. Senior strategy lead, external hire preferred. External hire preferred. I felt something still inside me. The role described was, functionally, what I was already doing. Expanded slightly, formalized, elevated. It was the natural next step for someone in my position. At least, that's what I had believed. The director asked, "Do we have internal candidates?" Daniel paused, not long but long enough. "Charlotte is excellent in her current scope," he said evenly, "but this role will require stronger executive-facing leadership and strategic storytelling at board level." Executive-facing leadership, strategic storytelling. I had built half the board decks that year. The director nodded thoughtfully. "Understood. Makes sense to broaden perspective externally." The slide advanced. The meeting continued. No one looked at me. It wasn't humiliating. It wasn't sharp. It was smooth, professional, logical. But in that moment, something reorganized in my mind. For years, I had assumed that if I demonstrated readiness, the pathway would eventually open. That growth was a matter of evidence. But this was evidence. Clear strategic preemptive positioning, an external hire preferred. Not because I was underperforming, not because I lacked skill, but because my advancement would disrupt an existing power structure. I didn't react. I took notes. As always, I asked a clarifying question about budget impact. My voice was steady. Inside, though, a quiet equation was forming. If I were promoted, Daniel would no longer be the singular strategic voice. My direct access to leadership would expand. My authorship would become visible. The narrative would decentralize. That wasn't a neutral shift. It was a threat, not to the company, to him. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and opened my notebook. I wrote down the phrasing from the slide. I wrote down his exact wording. I wrote down the director's response. Then I stopped writing. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had resisted for years. What if the barrier wasn't my readiness? What if it was his insecurity? It's uncomfortable to think that way about someone you've respected. It feels paranoid, self-protective, dramatic. So I tested the thought against data. I reviewed past performance feedback. Consistently strong. No formal development plan for deficiencies. I reviewed project ownership histories. Repeated patterns of reframed authorship. I reviewed promotion cycles. Repeated delays justified by abstract traits. Never measurable gaps. The pattern held, and once it held, everything realigned. The missed task force nomination. The reframed board presentation. The not yet language. The praise without progression. It wasn't random. It was containment. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Clarity is colder than anger. It removes hope selectively. It doesn't lash out, it recalibrates. I realized something else that day. I had been asking the wrong question. For years I asked, how do I prove I'm ready? The better question was, who benefits if I never appear ready? That shift changed everything, because once you understand incentive, you understand behavior. And Daniel's behavior made sense. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't sabotaging me out of malice. He was protecting his position in a system that rewarded visibility and singular authority. I had become too competent to dismiss, but too controlled to promote. That Tuesday, I stopped waiting for recognition. Not publicly, not dramatically, internally. Silence no longer meant patience. It meant assessment. I closed my notebook and looked at the office around me. The glass walls, the muted conversations, the hierarchy, invisible but intact. For the first time, I wasn't asking how to fit better inside it. I was asking whether I intended to stay inside it at all. The shift wasn't loud, but it was irreversible. After that Tuesday, I didn't change my behavior, at least not in ways anyone else could see. I still arrived early, I still delivered clean models. I still asked precise questions in meetings. I still sent structured follow-ups within the hour. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. Before, my silence had been hopeful. Now it was deliberate. There's a difference. Hopeful silence waits to be rewarded. Deliberate silence gathers information. I stopped volunteering emotional energy in one-on-ones. Where I once sought developmental feedback with quiet eagerness, I now listened with analytical distance. When Daniel praised my consistency, I noted the wording. When he referenced future potential, I registered the timeline, or lack of one. I no longer interpreted his framing as guidance. I interpreted it as strategy. And strategy can be studied. I began mapping patterns more formally. Which projects translated into visibility? Which stakeholders influenced promotion decisions? Which narratives persisted upward and which faded? I paid attention to when Daniel spoke in meetings, not just what he said, but how he positioned himself. He often framed decisions as clarifications rather than contributions. He would say, to refine what the team proposed, even when the refinement had originated from someone else. He didn't erase people, he absorbed them. It was subtle, elegant even. The more I observed, the calmer I became. Because understanding removes confusion, and confusion is exhausting. Colleagues still saw me as steady. One even joked, "You never seem rattled." I smiled. They mistook stillness for passivity, but stillness can be a form of calculation. I also began making small adjustments, not to confront, but to reposition. In cross-functional emails, I documented ownership more clearly. Instead of writing, we analyzed 3 scenarios. I wrote, I built 3 scenario models and aligned with Daniel on risk framing. Factual, neutral, traceable. In meetings, when referencing work, I used subtle anchors. When I structured the initial framework, or based on the financial model I developed, no accusation, no defensiveness, just clarity. Daniel noticed, though he didn't comment directly. What he did do was increase praise in private. "You've been more assertive lately," he said once, smiling. "That's good." Assertive. It was interesting that factual attribution registered as assertiveness. Still, nothing outwardly hostile occurred. No reprimands, no tension, just micro adjustments. The more I documented, the more I saw how dependent the team had become on my infrastructure. Key reporting pipelines, forecasting tools, institutional memory around vendor negotiations. Much of it lived in systems I had built or refined, not hoarded, built. And because I had built them quietly, few people fully understood their architecture. I didn't design them as leverage, but they were. That realization was not empowering in the triumphant sense. It was clarifying in the strategic sense. For the first time, I understood that my value wasn't just in output, it was in continuity. And continuity, when withdrawn, creates disruption. I didn't intend to withdraw recklessly. That would have violated my moral code. I don't believe in burning structures that still house others. But I did begin asking myself a different question. If my growth here is capped by design, where else could it expand? Instead of focusing on internal promotion cycles, I updated my external portfolio. I reconnected with former colleagues now working at other firms. I attended one industry event, quietly, without announcing it. I wasn't planning an escape yet. I was widening perspective. Daniel continued operating as usual. He involved me in planning sessions. He relied on my judgment. He framed team achievements carefully. From the outside, nothing had fractured. Inside, though, my loyalty had shifted. Before, I had been loyal to the hierarchy, to the idea that patience within the system would yield elevation. Now I was loyal to my own trajectory. Silence, when chosen, becomes powerful, because it unsettles those who rely on your predictability. And predictability had been my defining trait. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it had begun. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. From Daniel's perspective, I was still the same Charlotte. Dependable, analytical, calm. I continued delivering high-quality work. I continued stabilizing projects. I didn't escalate concerns. I didn't challenge authority in public forums. What he didn't notice was that my preparation had shifted from proving myself internally to positioning myself externally. The first thing I did was audit my own contributions, not emotionally, structurally. I created a private document outlining every major initiative I had led, co-led, or architected in the past 3 years. For each, I documented measurable impact, revenue projections influenced, cost reductions identified, risk exposures mitigated, cross-functional efficiencies created. I included version histories, email threads, timestamps, not because I anticipated conflict, because clarity requires evidence. I also began paying attention to what leadership valued most during promotion discussions. Not what was written in HR frameworks, but what was actually rewarded. Visibility in board settings, ownership of cross-functional outcomes, demonstrated influence beyond immediate scope. I realized something critical. I had already done most of those things. They just hadn't been labeled correctly. So I relabeled them, for myself first. When a quarterly report required strategic commentary, I offered to draft the executive summary directly and copied the director into the initial email. Not bypassing Daniel, simply expanding the distribution. When external partners asked complex questions, I volunteered to lead the call rather than send prepared talking points. Again, factual, professional, traceable. Daniel didn't block these moves. That was the interesting part. He didn't need to. His control had never been through overt restriction. It had been through narrative framing, and narratives only hold if no alternative record exists. I also strengthened relationships outside my immediate reporting line. Casual conversations with finance leads, coffee chats with operations directors, short follow-ups, after meetings thanking stakeholders for input, reinforcing connection. Nothing manipulative, just visibility built through consistency. At the same time, I began learning quietly. I took an advanced course in executive communication, not to sound louder, but to compress ideas more sharply. I refined how I framed risk in fewer words. I studied how senior leaders asked questions, what they cared about, what they skimmed. The more I learned, the clearer it became. I had never lacked capability. I had lacked positioning, and positioning is rarely granted. It's constructed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his pattern. He delegated increasingly complex analysis to me. He trusted my judgment on high-stakes modeling. He relied on my summaries before major presentations. But I noticed something subtle in him too. He had grown comfortable with my loyalty, comfortable with my silence, comfortable with the assumption that I would not disrupt his narrative. He spoke more freely in one-on-ones. "You're my strongest operator," he said once. "Honestly, I don't know how I'd run this team without you." It sounded complimentary, but I heard the subtext. If you move up, my structure shifts. Around that time, I discovered something almost accidental. During a cross-department strategy session, the director referenced a future restructuring conversation at executive level, one that Daniel had not mentioned to me. It involved consolidating strategic functions under a newly created leadership role. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied, because if restructuring was being discussed above Daniel's level, the hierarchy was not as static as he presented. That evening, I revisited my documentation file. I added new sections, stakeholder endorsements, cross-functional testimonials, measurable outcomes directly attributable to my frameworks. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building a case for myself. And cases, when constructed patiently, don't require accusation. They require contrast. I also began exploring discrete external conversations, not applying widely, not announcing anything, just informational calls with industry peers in similar roles at larger firms. Each conversation confirmed something quietly powerful. My skill set was not mid-level. It was senior. The realization didn't inflate me. It grounded me. Inside my current company, I had been calibrated as almost ready. Outside it, I was perceived as experienced and strategic. Perception is contextual, and context can be changed. Throughout all of this, I remained composed. No tension leaked into meetings. No frustration sharpened my tone. If anything, I became calmer. Because preparation reduces fear. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was positioning. Daniel never asked what I was building behind the scenes. He didn't notice the expanded email trails. He didn't question the external industry event I attended. He didn't see the private portfolio I was refining late at night. He believed I was anchored. He didn't realize I had already begun lifting. The quietest shifts are often the most consequential. And by then, I wasn't waiting for opportunity to be offered. I was preparing to choose it. The revelation didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived in the form of a forwarded email. One Friday afternoon, our department director accidentally included me in a thread meant only for senior leadership. It was brief, logistical, almost mundane, discussing succession planning scenarios tied to the upcoming restructuring. But one line stood out. If internal strategy capability remains concentrated under Daniel External hire for consolidation role will ensure independent oversight. Independent oversight. I read it twice, then a third time. The phrasing was careful, corporate, diplomatic, but the implication was unmistakable. Leadership recognized that strategic capability was heavily centralized under Daniel, and that concentration posed a governance concern. In other words, the issue wasn't my readiness. It was structural dependency. My mind moved quickly, but not emotionally. If leadership believed strategic capability remained concentrated under Daniel, that meant my contributions were effectively being perceived as his, not maliciously, structurally, which explained everything. The stalled promotion pathways, the preference for an external hire, the language around broadening perspective. They weren't questioning my competence. They were managing risk. Risk created by a single point of strategic control, and Daniel was that point. The irony settled in quietly. The very pattern he had cultivated, absorbing narrative ownership, centralizing visibility, was now triggering oversight from above. Not because anyone wanted to punish him, because governance requires distribution. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. For years, I had assumed I was being assessed independently, that my readiness was measured on its own merit. Now I understood something more nuanced. As long as my work flowed through Daniel without independent visibility, my growth would remain entangled with his positioning. It wasn't about personal rivalry. It was about power concentration. That weekend, I sat at my dining table with my notebook open and mapped the dynamics out plainly. If I stayed silent and continued operating as infrastructure, two outcomes were likely. An external leader would be hired above Daniel to ensure oversight, further distancing my path upward. My capability would remain bundled under his umbrella, indefinitely. If I disrupted the structure aggressively, I would violate my own moral code and risk reputational damage. But there was a third option. Decouple. Not emotionally, structurally. Instead of trying to rise within the current reporting line, I could reposition my expertise in a context where it was not subsumed under a single narrative owner. The clarity was almost mathematical. The reveal wasn't that Daniel feared I'd take his seat. It was that he had already behaved as if I might, and leadership had noticed the imbalance. That shifted my leverage. Not because I intended to expose him, I didn't, but because I now understood that my value was larger than the frame I had been given. On Monday, I behaved exactly as usual. I delivered a forecasting model. I aligned on timelines. I attended meetings. But internally, the decision-making lens had sharpened. When Daniel casually mentioned that executive restructuring discussions were still early and probably won't affect our team much, I noticed the omission. He knew. He just wasn't distributing that information. Again, not villainous. Protective. I asked one calm question. If consolidation happens, how do you see strategy ownership evolving? He paused, then answered smoothly. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Deferral. I nodded. But I already understood the bridge. That week, I scheduled 2 external informational interviews. Quietly. During lunch breaks, I refined my portfolio summary to highlight independent ownership rather than team contribution. I requested a brief catch-up with the director under the pretense of clarifying long-term development, not to accuse, but to listen. During that conversation, I asked carefully framed questions about succession planning and strategic visibility. The director responded thoughtfully and candidly. We need stronger distributed leadership, she admitted. Right now, too much strategic insight is concentrated. She didn't say Daniel's name. She didn't need to. In that moment, I realized something powerful. I wasn't trapped. I was underestimated. And underestimation, when paired with documentation and timing, becomes leverage. The private reveal wasn't emotional. It was structural clarity. I saw the full system. Daniel's protective positioning, leadership's governance concern, my misattributed capability as interconnected parts. And once you see the system, you can choose where to apply pressure. Not through confrontation, through alignment. I closed my notebook that evening with an unfamiliar feeling. Not frustration, not resentment, just certainty. The ceiling I had felt for years wasn't invisible. It had a name, and now I knew exactly how it was constructed. Once you see the structure clearly, you can't go back to hopeful interpretation. The system was no longer abstract to me. I understood the incentives. I understood Daniel's positioning. I understood leadership's concern about concentrated strategic control. Now the question was simple. What was I going to do with that clarity? There were realistically 4 options. The first was endurance. Stay. Continue performing. Wait for restructuring to naturally redistribute authority. Hope the consolidation role, whether internal or external, created space above Daniel that I could eventually occupy. It was the safest path. It was also the slowest, and it relied on variables outside my control. The second option was confrontation. Schedule a direct conversation with Daniel, present evidence of my contributions, challenge the narrative framing, demand clearer succession planning. It would have felt powerful in the moment, but it would also force him into defense, and defensive leaders rarely redistribute power willingly. The third option was escalation. Approach senior leadership directly. Frame the concentration of strategy under one person as a structural risk. Position myself as the corrective solution. That path might work, but it would violate something fundamental in me. I don't believe in rising by undermining. Even if the critique was valid, the method would leave residue. The fourth option was the quietest. Decouple completely, not by leaving impulsively, not by resigning dramatically, but by repositioning myself where my work would no longer be filtered through someone invested in containing it. It wasn't about proving Daniel wrong. It was about removing myself from a system that required him to feel secure at my expense. I sat with that realization for several days. There's a particular stillness that comes before irreversible decisions. It's not loud. It doesn't come with adrenaline. It feels almost calm, like recognizing a door you hadn't noticed before. During that week, Daniel leaned on me heavily. We were preparing another high-level strategic review. I drafted the core narrative again. I structured the growth scenarios again. And as I did, I paid attention to a quiet truth. I could continue building structures for someone else to present, or I could build them under my own name. One afternoon, an external contact I had spoken with weeks earlier reached out. A larger firm was quietly exploring a director-level strategy role. The scope described was almost identical to what I was already operating at, but with independent board access. Independent board access. The phrase lingered. I didn't react immediately. I asked for more information. I reviewed the firm's financials. I evaluated culture reports. I studied the reporting line. It wasn't a fantasy opportunity. It was real, structured, aligned, and most importantly, it didn't require anyone else's narrative permission. The decision crystallized not from ambition, but from alignment. If I stayed, I would continue negotiating someone else's insecurity. If I confronted, I would escalate tension without structural guarantee. If I escalated internally, I would fracture trust. If I left strategically, I would simply reposition my value. That was the irreversible option, because once you choose growth outside a contained system, you cannot return to waiting inside it. I accepted the second round interview. I didn't tell Daniel, not out of secrecy, out of sequence. There is no obligation to announce preparation before it becomes decision. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued performing at the same standard. No withdrawal, no passive aggression, no visible dissatisfaction. But internally, I had crossed a threshold. For the first time in years, my future no longer depended on Daniel's endorsement. It depended on my clarity. When the formal offer came, competitive compensation, elevated title, direct executive exposure, I didn't feel triumph. I felt symmetry. The role matched the level I had already been operating at. I read the offer letter twice, closed my laptop, sat still. This was the irreversible move, not because it harmed anyone, but because it removed me from a dynamic that had quietly defined my ceiling. And once I stepped outside that ceiling, it could never contain me again. I signed, calmly, decisively, without resentment. Growth doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires departure. After I signed the offer, nothing about my external behavior changed. That was intentional. There's a misconception that once you decide to leave, detachment becomes obvious. That performance slips. That subtle resentment leaks through tone. I didn't allow that. If anything, I became sharper. I completed every outstanding initiative with precision. I finalized documentation for long-term forecasting tools. I cleaned up shared drives. I organized reporting dashboards so that transitions would be seamless. Not because I owed the system loyalty, but because I owed myself integrity. I didn't want my departure to look like retreat. I wanted it to look like completion. The formal notice period in the UK is generous. Mine was 3 months. I calculated the timeline carefully. The external firm agreed to align with it. I chose a quiet Thursday morning to schedule a one-on-one with Daniel. Before that meeting, however, I made two strategic moves. First, I scheduled a brief conversation with the department director. I framed it simply. I wanted to let you know personally before formal announcements. When I told her I had accepted a director-level strategy position elsewhere, she didn't look surprised. She looked thoughtful. That makes sense, she said slowly. You've been operating at that level for some time. Not will operate. Have been operating. The phrasing confirmed what I already knew. Second, I compiled a transition document so detailed it bordered on architectural. Every ongoing initiative, every stakeholder relationship, every reporting cadence, ownership lines clearly defined. Because once you remove infrastructure, the absence becomes visible. Then I walked into Daniel's office. He greeted me as usual, casual, focused. I wanted to speak with you about something important, I said. My voice was steady. I've accepted a director of strategy role at another firm. My notice period will begin formally next week. Silence, not dramatic silence, analytical silence. He leaned back in his chair. I see, he said. A pause. I didn't realize you were looking. I met his gaze evenly. I wasn't actively looking. The opportunity aligned. That was true. He nodded slowly. Congratulations, that's significant. Significant. There it was. Acknowledgement without admission. He asked practical questions next. Start date, scope, compensation band. He kept his tone professional, controlled. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. This will leave a gap. You're central to how we run strategy. Central. I held that word quietly. I've prepared a transition framework, I replied. I'll ensure continuity. He looked at me differently then. Not dismissively, not warmly. Assessing. For the first time in years, I wasn't positioned beneath him in future planning. I was stepping outside his structure entirely. Over the following weeks, the consequences unfolded subtly. Requests that used to route automatically through me became delayed. Forecasting updates took longer. Cross-functional alignment meetings lacked cohesion. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. Colleagues began approaching me with a different tone. I didn't realize how much you were holding together. I thought Daniel was leading most of this. I didn't correct them. Correction wasn't necessary anymore. Daniel, to his credit, never reacted with hostility. He remained professional, but I sensed something beneath his composure. Recalibration. He began taking a more active role in detailed modeling. He scheduled additional syncs with other team members. He attempted to redistribute responsibilities, and in doing so, he exposed something. The depth of strategic continuity had not been concentrated under him. It had been distributed, with me carrying a disproportionate share. The restructuring conversations at executive level accelerated. Leadership now had to reconsider whether an external oversight hire was still the right solution, or whether the internal strategic core had just shifted entirely. I wasn't involved in those discussions anymore, and that was the point. Moving in silence doesn't create chaos. It reveals dependency. On my final week, I completed the last handover meeting. I closed shared folders. I archived personal notes. Daniel stopped by my desk one last time. I underestimated how quickly this would impact us. He admitted quietly, not defensively, just factually. I nodded. I'm confident the team will adjust. He studied me for a moment. You've always been composed, he said. I hope they recognize what they're getting. I didn't respond to the subtext, because recognition was no longer my negotiation. It was my environment, and I had already changed it. The first signs weren't dramatic. They were operational. 2 weeks after my departure, I received a message from a former colleague. Quick question. Where did you store the scenario variance assumptions for Q4? We can't trace the logic. I sent a concise reply with the documentation link. I had structured everything clearly. Nothing was hidden. Still, the message lingered. It wasn't that the file was missing. It was that the connective thinking behind it wasn't obvious without context. Systems can be documented. Judgment takes time to transfer. Over the next month, I heard similar things, indirectly. Board decks were delayed by a few days. Cross-functional meetings required more follow-ups. Forecast adjustments lacked the same anticipatory detail. Not catastrophic, but friction had increased. And friction in high-level strategy is visible. At my new firm, meanwhile, I was already leading sessions directly with executive leadership. The difference was immediate, not in workload, but in attribution. When I presented a growth model, my name was on the slide header. When I reframed a risk scenario mid-discussion, it was recorded in meeting notes as my adjustment. Not because the environment was perfect, because the reporting line was direct. There was no narrative filter. Back at my former company, restructuring discussions intensified. Without me anchoring the strategic backbone, leadership began asking sharper questions about continuity. A senior executive reportedly asked, "Why did we allow our most operationally central strategist to leave?" It wasn't accusatory. It was analytical. Daniel, I was told, responded professionally. He framed it as career progression, growth opportunity, competitive market movement, all accurate. But what couldn't be reframed was the vacuum. The consolidation role, the one originally marked as external hire preferred, was paused. Leadership reconsidered whether importing oversight would solve the issue or simply layer complexity over instability. The irony was quiet and precise. The system that had once positioned me as supportive infrastructure was now adjusting because that infrastructure had moved. I didn't feel satisfaction, only symmetry. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after my departure, I received a message from Daniel. Short, direct. "Would you be open to a brief call? Purely informal." I considered it carefully before responding. "Yes. Next Thursday works." Duh. When we spoke, his tone was controlled but less guarded than before. "I'll be transparent," he said. "Your departure has shifted how leadership views strategic distribution here." Shifted. "Restructuring is accelerating," he continued. "There's increased scrutiny on how capability was concentrated." He didn't frame it as blame. He framed it as evolution. I listened. Then he said something that revealed the full arc. "In hindsight, I may have relied on you more than I realized." More than I realized. Dependence disguised as delegation. I didn't respond defensively. I didn't correct him. I simply said, "The team will adapt." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a moment. This wasn't vindication. It was consequence. When high-functioning contributors leave contained systems, the absence exposes the architecture that relied on containment. Not through revenge, through removal. Over the following months, I heard that Daniel's role was adjusted. Strategic oversight responsibilities were redistributed. A co-lead structure was introduced to ensure broader visibility. He wasn't demoted. He wasn't publicly criticized. But singular authority had shifted. The ceiling that once constrained me had cracked. Not because I pushed against it, but because I stepped out from under it. At my new firm, I continued building. Not aggressively, not competitively, simply directly. The difference in energy was measurable. Ideas didn't require translation upward through protective framing. Risk ownership was shared transparently. Growth conversations were concrete. I wasn't almost ready. I was accountable. And accountability, when paired with authority, is grounding. The consequences back there were still unfolding, but they were no longer mine to manage. The system had to rebalance itself without the quiet stability it had taken for granted. And sometimes, that is the only feedback powerful enough to recalibrate perception. Not confrontation, absence. About 3 months after I left, the call came again. This time it wasn't informal. It was deliberate. Daniel asked if I would consider meeting in person. Neutral location. Coffee near the old office. I agreed. Not out of nostalgia. Not out of obligation. Out of closure. When I arrived, he was already seated. Same posture, same composed exterior. But something had shifted. There was less certainty in the way he held himself. After brief pleasantries, he moved directly to the point. "The restructuring has finalized," he said. "Strategy is now split into 2 vertical leads. I'm overseeing one. The other reports directly to the executive committee." A pause. "It's essentially the structure we discussed before you left." Discussed. We had never explicitly discussed it, but we had both understood it. He continued, "In hindsight, I think I underestimated how ready you were for that level." Underestimated. The word was careful, controlled. Not an apology, but close to admission. "I thought protecting the narrative upward would give you more time to develop," he added. Instead, it limited visibility. There it was. Not sabotage. Containment framed as mentorship. I listened without interrupting. "I wanted to ask," he said slowly, "whether you would ever consider returning in a more senior capacity." The offer wasn't formal, it wasn't detailed, it was exploratory, but it carried something heavier than compensation. It carried regret. I considered the question honestly. 3 months earlier, that invitation would have validated years of effort. It would have felt like justice. Now it felt late. Not because I was resentful, because I had already grown past the context that required validation. "I appreciate that," I said evenly, "but I'm building something where I am." He nodded. I suspected as much. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just reflective. Then he said something that revealed the final layer. I think I was afraid of losing control of the strategic narrative. Not afraid of me personally, afraid of decentralization. He met my eyes. You were capable of operating independently, and I wasn't prepared for that shift. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation, just acknowledgement. For a long time, I had wondered whether he consciously blocked my path. The truth was more complex. He had managed risk. The risk was losing singular authority, and by doing so, he created the very instability leadership later sought to correct. The irony was quiet but complete. If he had distributed visibility earlier, I might have stayed. The system might have evolved smoothly. Trust might have deepened. Instead, protection delayed growth, and delay accelerated loss. I don't think you acted maliciously, I said calmly, but the structure didn't allow both of us to expand. He absorbed that. No, he agreed, it didn't. There was no bitterness in me, just clarity. You cannot retrofit fairness after someone has already found alignment elsewhere. You cannot rebuild trust in a system someone has outgrown. Timing matters, and timing had passed. When we stood to leave, he extended his hand. I hope we cross paths professionally again, he said. I'm sure we will, I replied. And I meant it, because this was never about burning bridges. It was about stepping beyond ceilings. By the time an environment realizes it constrains someone prematurely, the individual has often already recalibrated. And recalibration, once complete, doesn't reverse. It integrates. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to learn. But learning doesn't guarantee return. And growth, once tasted in full autonomy, rarely shrinks itself to fit old rooms. I walked away from that meeting lighter, not victorious, free. A few weeks after that coffee meeting, I was invited back to my former company, not for a role, not for negotiation, but to present at an industry roundtable they were hosting. It was professional, neutral, symbolic. I accepted. The event focused on strategic governance and scaling organizations. Irony has a quiet sense of timing. When I arrived at the office building I had walked into for years, nothing felt heavy. Familiar, yes, but not charged. Daniel was part of the hosting panel. We greeted each other politely. No tension, no awkwardness, just acknowledgement. During the roundtable, I spoke about distributed leadership models, about the risk of concentrating strategic insight under one narrative channel, about the importance of visible ownership aligned with accountability. I didn't reference the past. I didn't reference him. I spoke in principles. After my segment, one attendee asked a question. How do you recognize when strategic talent is being underutilized internally? The room went still, not dramatically, but attentively. I answered carefully. When contribution consistently exceeds visibility and feedback remains abstract instead of structural, that's often a signal. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's simply inertia, but inertia has consequences. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't need to. Later during a break, he approached me. You've sharpened your framing, he said. I've had direct exposure, I replied calmly. He nodded, understanding the layered meaning. There was no hostility between us now, just clarity. For years I had imagined what confrontation might feel like, whether I would ever say plainly, you blocked my path. But standing there, I realized something important. I didn't need to accuse. The system had already acknowledged the imbalance. The restructuring had redistributed authority. Leadership had adjusted governance. My growth had occurred elsewhere. Confrontation without heat is different from confrontation without truth. Truth had already surfaced. Through absence, through restructuring, through admission over coffee. There was nothing left to force. At one point, Daniel said quietly, I hope you know I did value your work. I know, I replied, and I meant that too. The issue had never been whether he valued me. It was whether he was willing to decentralize himself. That distinction mattered. As the event concluded, a few former colleagues approached me. You seem different, one said. More defined. Defined. I thought about that word on my way home. When you operate inside someone else's narrative frame, your edges blur. You adapt to the structure. You soften corners to fit. Outside of it, your lines sharpen. Not aggressively, accurately. The confrontation I once imagined, emotional, declarative, explosive, never happened. Instead, it unfolded through calm acknowledgement. He admitted fear. I acknowledged limitation. The system corrected itself, slowly, and I moved on. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is not spoken in accusation. It is embodied in evolution. There was no need to win. The shift had already occurred, and in that shift, the hierarchy that once defined us had dissolved into parallel paths. No heat, no bitterness, just clarity standing in the same room without shrinking. When people ask me what changed, they expect a dramatic answer. They expect me to say I became more assertive, more outspoken, more ambitious. The truth is quieter than that. I didn't become louder. I became aligned. At my new firm, I hold the title Director of Strategy. But the title isn't what defines the shift. What defines it is direct authorship. When I build a framework, I present it. When I recommend a pivot, I defend it. When outcomes succeed or fail, my name is attached to both. There is something grounding about that symmetry. Responsibility and visibility in equal measure. In my previous role, I carried responsibility without full visibility. That imbalance creates subtle erosion. You work harder to be seen. You adjust yourself to fit narrative gaps. Now, I don't adjust. I refine. There's a difference. I still carry my black leather notebook into meetings. I still listen before speaking. I still prefer precision over volume. But I no longer mistake silence for strategy. If I have a point that alters direction, I voice it in the moment. Not later in a follow-up email that someone else might frame. Not aggressively, just clearly. What changed most, though, wasn't my behavior. It was my self-perception. For years, I believed that growth required patience inside existing systems. That if I worked well enough, long enough, the structure would eventually expand to accommodate me. Now I understand something more nuanced. Not every system is designed for your expansion. Some are designed for stability, and if your growth threatens that stability, the system will quietly slow you down. Not because you lack merit, but because you alter balance. That realization removed bitterness. Daniel wasn't a villain. He was protecting equilibrium. The company wasn't malicious. It was preserving hierarchy. The misalignment was structural, not personal. And once I stopped personalizing it, I stopped shrinking inside it. Today, I mentor younger analysts differently. When one of them tells me they feel almost ready, I don't tell them to be patient automatically. I ask sharper questions. Who benefits from you staying almost? Is feedback concrete or abstract? Are you being developed or contained? I also distribute visibility deliberately. When someone builds a framework, I name them in the room. When a junior strategist reframes a risk clearly, I credit them directly. Not performatively, structurally, because I understand now how easily ownership can be absorbed upward. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you left before resentment hardened. I didn't scorch the ground. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't wait for permission. I repositioned. And in repositioning, I discovered that my ceiling had never been about capability. It had been about context. Who I am now isn't someone who fights for recognition. It's someone who chooses environments where recognition aligns naturally with contribution. That's quieter, but it's stronger. I no longer wonder whether I'm ready. I assess whether the structure around me is, and if it isn't, I know I have options. Not because I'm fearless, because I've seen what happens when you outgrow a room and step into one built for you. There's no bitterness in that, only proportion. For a long time, I thought the hardest part of my story would be confrontation. It wasn't. The hardest part was recognition. Recognizing that the ceiling I felt wasn't invisible. Recognizing that the feedback I received wasn't developmental. It was directional. Recognizing that someone could value me and still limit me at the same time. That duality is uncomfortable. We prefer clean villains and clean heroes. We prefer to believe that if something blocks us, it must be malicious. But often, it's quieter than that. Sometimes you are not being attacked. You are being contained. Contained because your growth changes balance. Contained because your visibility decentralizes power. Contained because your readiness forces someone else to evolve. And not everyone is ready to evolve. The moment I realized my direct manager had blocked every path of my promotion because he feared I'd take his seat, I expected anger. Instead, I felt clarity. Missed opportunities, stalled evaluations, invisible ceilings. They weren't evidence of my inadequacy. They were evidence of misalignment. My growth wasn't a threat to the company. It was a threat to him. That understanding changed how I moved. I didn't retaliate. I didn't expose. I didn't perform outrage. I prepared. And when the right alignment appeared, I stepped into it without noise. Here's what I've learned. If your contribution consistently exceeds your visibility, pay attention. If feedback remains abstract year after year, pay attention. If you are praised for stability, but never positioned for elevation, pay attention. Not to assign blame, but to assess structure. Some rooms are built for your early development. Some are built for your maintenance. Very few are built for your expansion. It is not betrayal to leave a room that no longer fits you. It is not disloyal to outgrow containment. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is not to confront the ceiling, but to step outside of it. There was no dramatic ending in my story, no public humiliation, no revenge arc, just a quiet shift. And sometimes quiet dominance looks exactly like that. Choosing growth without needing permission. If you've ever felt like you were almost ready for too long, if you've ever sensed that your effort was stabilizing someone else's authority, ask yourself gently, are you being developed or are you being contained? I'd really like to know. Have you ever realized that your ceiling wasn't about your ability, but about someone else's fear?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.